He was a pressure against the door, a weight in the wailing wind that was heavier than the storm. Ilara did not need to see him to know he was there. She had felt his approach an hour ago, a shift in the fabric of the world, the air growing dense and charged as if before a lightning strike. The Alpha King of the Blackwood Pack did not move without consequence. Now he stood on the other side of her threshold, a silent monolith in the tempest, and did not knock. Inside, the world was small and safe. The scent of dried lavender and chamomile hung in the warm air, a fragile defense against the smell of ozone and wet earth that bled through the doorframe. 6 of them, the royal pups, were curled together on a pallet of old furs near the hearth, their silver and sable coats rising and falling in the synchronized rhythm of sleep. They had arrived like a tide of panicked fur and whimpers, their palace nannies left far behind, instinct driving them not to the fortified stone of the royal dens, but to this small, wattle and daub shelter at the forgotten edge of the territory. To her, Ilara added another log to the fire, the soft crackle and hiss of damp wood catching flame. The sound was small, but in the charged silence between the gusts of wind, it felt like a confession. He would have heard it. He heard everything. She knew what he wanted. He had come to take the pups home. He had come to restore order, to retrieve the pieces of his legacy from the home of a woman who was, by all accounts, a piece of their history they had tried to discard, an omega. A word that was supposed to mean pliant, submissive, harmless. She had learned to wear the word like a cloak, letting its assumptions conceal the truth of her. She was not harmless, she was simply quiet. And in a world of roaring alphas, quiet was its own kind of power. He was still out there. She could feel the focus of his stillness, a singular point of immense gravity. He was not waiting for the storm to pass. He was not gathering his resolve. He was simply being there. And his being there was an act of violence against the quiet world she had built. It was a question she was not prepared to answer. She ran a hand over the sleeping head of the smallest pup, Lyra, whose coat was the color of ash. The pup sighed and burrowed deeper into the warmth of her litter mates. They were not afraid here. In the palace, they were heirs. They were symbols, tiny vessels for the pack's future, their every move monitored and corrected. Here, they were just children seeking comfort from a storm. She offered them nothing but warmth and the freedom to be small, and it was the one thing their gilded lives could not provide. The wind tore at the roof, and a loose shutter banged against the outer wall. A sharp, repetitive thudding against the howl of the wind. The pups stirred, a collective murmur of unease. Ilara rose and went to the single window, her bare feet silent on the smooth, worn floorboards. She did not look toward the door. Instead, she peered through a crack in the shutter, out into the maelstrom. The forest was a thrashing, liquid darkness, the ancient pines bowing like supplicants. She could not see him, but she did not need to. He was an anchor in the chaos, a point of stillness she could navigate by. Why did he not knock? It was his right. He was the Alpha King. He could have torn the door from its hinges and no one would have questioned it, but he did not. That was far more dangerous. A king who took what he wanted by force was predictable. A king who waited, who watched, who stood in a tempest for hours without asserting his power. He was unknowable, and that terrified her more than any display of dominance. She returned to the hearth, her back to the door, a deliberate act of dismissal she knew he would feel as keenly as a physical blow. She sat, pulling a worn blanket around her shoulders, and prepared to wait him out. The storm would break. He would grow cold. The The demands of his position would call him back. He would eventually knock. But for now, they were caught in this strange equilibrium. The king in the storm, the omega by the fire, and the sleeping future of the pack between them. He came to take the pups home. He stood outside her door until morning instead. The gray light of dawn bled through the cracks in the shutters, diluting the shadows in her small home. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly silent. The wind was gone, the rain was gone, and the pressure against her door was gone. For a moment, she thought he had left, that the night had been a strange fever dream brought on by the tempest. But when she unlatched the heavy wooden bolt and pulled the door inward, he was there. He stood in the same spot, though the world around him had transformed. The rising sun caught the silver threads in his black hair, each one seeming to hold a bead of captured rain. He was soaked through, his dark tunic clinging to the hard lines of his body. Mud stained the hem of his trousers and his boots. He looked less like a king and more like a remnant of the storm itself, something elemental and exhausted that had been left behind when the chaos receded. His eyes, the color of winter frost, met hers. They were not angry, they were not demanding, they were simply watching, and the weight of that gaze was as heavy as his presence had been all night. He did not speak. Alara did not either. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of water dripping from the eaves, a slow, rhythmic dripping. She stepped aside, a silent invitation. It was not deference, it was a statement. She would not bar his way, but she would not yield either. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. He did not look at the pups, still sleeping soundly, their small bodies radiating a warmth that filled the single room. His gaze instead swept over her home, taking in the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the neat stack of books on a low table, the loom in the corner with a half-finished weaving of forest greens and deep blues. He was cataloging her, understanding the space she had carved for herself out of the world's indifference. It was a violation, this quiet inventory, and she felt a prickle of anger. This place was hers. It was the one part of her life that had not been dictated by rank or tragedy. "They are unharmed," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, the first words spoken between them. It was a fact, not an offering of reassurance. "I can see that." His voice was low, a gravelly sound like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. It held a weariness that went deeper than a single sleepless night. He finally looked at the pups, and for a fleeting instant, something in his expression softened. The iron control wavered, and she saw not the king, but the father. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, the mask of command settling back into place. He took a step closer to the hearth, and the scent of rain and cold stone followed him, an intrusion on the warm, herby air of her home. Alara stood her ground, forcing him to move around her. It was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. She would not be made to feel like a servant in her own house. He stopped before the pallet of furs, looking down at the sleeping children. Lyra, the smallest, chose that moment to stir, her tiny nose twitching. She opened her eyes, blinked up at her father, and then, without hesitation, she crawled away from him and buried her face in Alara's leg, her small hands clutching the rough fabric of her trousers. The rejection was stark, absolute, and utterly innocent. A muscle feathered in Kalen's jaw. He did not look at Alara, but she felt his awareness of her, sharp and sudden. He had stood vigil all night, had endured the storm for them, and in the end, they still chose her. "I will have their nannies sent for them," he said, his voice clipped. It was a retreat, and they both knew it. He turned to leave, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. "The roof needs repair," he said, not looking back. "The western eaves are damaged." And then he was gone. Alara stood motionless, the small weight of the pup against her leg anchoring her to the spot. She stared at the empty doorway, at the clean, cold light of the new day pouring in. He hadn't thanked her. He hadn't threatened her. He had simply observed a flaw in her world and named it, a parting shot that was both an insult and, strangely, an acknowledgement. He had seen her, not as an omega, not as a recluse, but as a person with a leaking roof. The intimacy of it was a cold shock. She looked down at Lyra, stroking the soft fur on her head. The king had left, but the consequences of his vigil were just beginning to settle. The silence he left behind was heavier than the one his presence had created. Kalen kept his word. 2 days later, a man appeared at her door, a quiet, grim-faced builder from the Citadel who spoke little and worked with unnerving efficiency. He did not ask for payment. He did not mention the king. He simply repaired the storm damage to her roof, replaced the broken shutter, and was gone by dusk. The act was a brand. It marked her shelter as a place under the Alpha King's notice, a fact that did not go unobserved. The whispers started small, eddies in the great river of pack life. Why had the royal pups fled to her? Why had the king himself retrieved them? And why, the most dangerous question of all, was he now seeing to the upkeep of an outcast's hovel? Alara felt the shift in the air whenever she went to the river for water or into the deeper woods to forage. The glances from the few pack members she encountered lingered a moment too long, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She had spent years cultivating invisibility, and Kalen had destroyed it in a single night. He began to appear at the edge of her clearing more frequently. He never approached her home again, but she would see him, a dark shape moving through the trees on the far side of the creek that marked her unofficial boundary. He was always alone, his royal guard conspicuously absent. He would stand for a time watching the smoke curl from her chimney, his posture betraying nothing. It was not surveillance. It felt like something else, something she could not name. It felt like a question he was asking himself, over and over. One afternoon, as she was tending her small garden, she saw him speaking with Lord Vorlag. The elder had sought him out, his silver and black robes a stark sigil of tradition against the wild green of the forest. Vorlag's face was a mask of placid concern, but Alara knew him for what he was. The architect of the pack's rigid hierarchies, the keeper of the laws that had pushed her to the margins. Even from a distance, she could feel the pressure Vorlag was exerting, the subtle manipulation in his posture, the way he gestured vaguely toward her cottage as if it were a blight. Kalen stood perfectly still, listening. He gave nothing away, his face as unreadable as a stone. But Alara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Vorlag was the voice of the pack's history, a history that had no place for an Omega who drew the attention of its king. The pups, too, became a problem. They remembered the safety of her hearth. They began to invent reasons to be near the edge of the palace grounds, their games straying ever closer to the path that led to her door. Their nannies were frantic, their guards frustrated. One evening, Lyra appeared alone, a tiny, determined ball of fluff who had slipped her minders. She carried a slightly crushed wildflower in her mouth, which she deposited solemnly on Alara's doorstep before turning to flee. the soft thud of a small body landing after a jump, then the rapid patter of paws receding. Alara picked up the small bruised flower. It was a columbine, a flower that, in the old lore, meant foolishness or courage. She wasn't sure which the pup intended. She was standing there, the flower in her hand, when she felt his presence again. Kalen stood at the tree line, watching her. This time, he did not remain distant. He walked forward, crossing the creek in 2 long strides, violating the unspoken boundary between their worlds. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling over her. "This cannot continue," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of a problem they now shared. "They are children," Alara replied, her voice level. "They go where they feel safe. Their safety is in the citadel, with their pack." "Is it?" The question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a stone. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, anger, perhaps both. "You are an Omega, living on the sufferance of my rule," he stated, the words cold and formal, a reminder of the power he held. "You would do well to remember that." "I have never been allowed to forget it," she said, her gaze unwavering. She held up the crushed columbine. "Your daughter does not seem to care about my station." He looked at the flower, then back at her. The silence between them was a razor's edge. He was the king. He could command her to turn the pups away, to make them fear her. He could have her driven from the territory altogether. It was his right. But he had stood outside her door all night in a storm, and that single, inexplicable act had changed the grammar of their world. He had witnessed her, and now he could not unsee her. "What do you want?" he finally asked, the words raw, stripped of all authority. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "To be left alone," she answered, just as honestly. But as she said it, looking at the man before her, a man trapped inside his own kingship, she realized with a sinking feeling that it was no longer the truth. A month later, the sickness came. It started in the royal nurseries, a quiet fever that stole the breath from the youngest pups, leaving them listless and weak. It was a strange ailment, unresponsive to the pack's healers with their tinctures and their clinical, precise methods. It clung to the children like a frost, a creeping cold that no fire could warm. Panic, tightly controlled but pervasive, began to ripple through the citadel. The airs were fading, and the pack's power, so absolute and imposing, was useless against it. Lyra was the worst affected. Alara heard the news from a passing hunter, who traded news for a salve for his hands. The man's words were clipped, his eyes full of fear. The king was desperate. He had locked down the nurseries, allowing no one in or out, but the sickness was already inside the walls, and it was winning. 2 nights later, he came. There was no storm this time, only a suffocating stillness and a sky choked with stars. He did not wait at the edge of her clearing, and he did not stand vigil at her door. He knocked, a single solid knock. The sound was an admission of defeat. When she opened the door, he was holding Lyra, her small body wrapped in a heavy fur blanket. The pup was terrifyingly still, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. The king's face was a ruin. The iron control was gone, stripped away by fear, leaving only the raw terror of a father. He had not come as the Alpha King. He had come as a supplicant. "Help her," he said. The words were broken. Alara looked at the child, at the faint blue tinge to her lips, and knew this was a sickness she recognized. It was not of the body alone. It was a withering of the spirit, an old magic that fed on sorrow. The Citadel healers, with their focus on the physical, would never have seen it. "Bring her inside," she said, her voice soft. She took the child from him, her own arm surprisingly steady. Lyra was light, her body holding almost no warmth. Kalen followed her into the small house, his presence overwhelming the space. He looked lost, his power and authority meaningless here. He was just a man, terrified and helpless. "They are all sick," he said, watching as she laid Lyra on the pallet by the fire. "The others are not this bad. Yet." Ilara did not answer. She was already moving, her hands sure and swift. She lit a bundle of dried sage, letting the pungent, cleansing smoke fill the room. She crushed nightshade berries and silver thistle in a stone mortar, the rhythmic grinding a counterpoint to the pup's shallow breathing, the steady rhythmic crunch of stone on stone. He stood by the door, a sentinel of grief, watching her work. He did not understand what she was doing. Her methods were not his world's methods. This was the wild magic his father's regime had outlawed, the knowledge they had tried to erase, the very reason her family had been stripped of its titles and she had been branded an Omega and exiled to this forgotten patch of land. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It is a grief chill," she said, not looking up from her work. "It takes root in spirits that feel untethered. The storm frightened them more than anyone knew. It made them feel unsafe in their own home." "Unsafe in your home." The words hung in the air between them, an indictment. She mixed the crushed herbs with warm water and, using a soft cloth, began to bathe the pup's face and paws. She began to hum, a low, ancient melody without words. It was a song of grounding, a song of roots and stone and deep, quiet places. Kalen watched, his face a conflict of desperation and ingrained distrust. He was allowing a practitioner of forbidden arts to tend to his child, to the future of his pack. He was betraying every law he was sworn to uphold. "I will stay," he said. It was not a request. He was not leaving his daughter's side. Ilara nodded, a small, sharp movement of her chin. "The others," she said. "If you want me to help them, you must bring them here." He stared at her, the magnitude of her demand settling in, to bring all the royal children to this hovel, to place them in the care of an outcast. It was political suicide. It was an admission that the throne, the citadel, the entire structure of their pack had failed. It would give his enemies, men like Vorlag, all the ammunition they would ever need. He looked at Lyra, whose breathing seemed to have eased ever so slightly under Ilara's care. He looked at Ilara, her face illuminated by the firelight, serene and focused, and he made his choice. "I will bring them at sunrise," he said. The king had come to her for help. Now, he was placing the entire future of his line in her hands. The balance of their world had not just shifted, it had shattered. He brought them as the sun crested the mountains, carrying to himself and flanked by two grim-faced guards who carried the others. The guards' eyes were wide with disbelief and suspicion as they entered her home, their polished armor and clean scent of steel a jarring intrusion. Kalen dismissed them with a curt nod, and they retreated to the edge of the clearing, their disapproval a palpable force. Soon, her small home was filled with the sick children, their quiet, labored breathing the only sound. Kalen stood by the door, a silent, helpless giant, as Ilara moved among them. She worked without pause. For 3 days and 3 nights, the shelter became a sanctuary of focused ritual. The air grew thick with the scent of herbs, rosemary for memory, willow bark for pain, elderflower for fevered dreams. She brewed teas in a large iron pot over the fire, the liquid a dark, earthy red. The first time she made it, she administered it to the pups drop by drop. Kalen watched her every move, his initial distrust slowly giving way to a kind of awe. He saw not wild, chaotic magic, but a deep, ordered knowledge of the world, a language he had forgotten how to speak. They barely spoke. Words were an unnecessary currency. Their communication happened in the spaces between actions. On the second night, she prepared a cup of the dark tea for herself, her hands moving with the weariness of exhaustion. She sat by the fire, cradling the warm ceramic, and he watched her from the shadows where he stood. He saw the deep lines of fatigue around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. He saw the strength that held her upright, a resilience forged in a fire he could only guess at. He had thought of her as a recluse, a forgotten piece of the pack. He now saw her as a fortress, a woman who had built a world for herself from the ruins of the one that had been taken from her. On the third night, she brewed the tea again. She poured one cup for herself, and then, after a moment's hesitation, she poured a second. She walked over to him, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards, and held it out. He looked down at the steaming cup, then at her. Her face was impassive, but in her eyes he saw the immense risk she was taking. It was more than a drink. It was an offering of trust, a bridge across the chasm of rank and history that separated them. He took the cup, the faint clink of ceramic as his fingers brushed hers. The warmth spread through his hand, a startling, grounding sensation. He drank. The tea was bitter, earthy, and strangely vital. It tasted of the forest, of deep roots and dark soil. It tasted like her. He lowered the cup, their eyes meeting over the rim. In that shared, silent moment, he was no longer a king and she was no longer an omega. They were simply two people in a small room, fighting a quiet war against the darkness. It was then that she finally spoke, her voice low. "You fear what Vorlag will say." It wasn't a question. "Vorlag fears what he does not control," Kalen replied, his own voice rough. "He sees the old ways as a threat to his order, to the laws our fathers made." "Your father's laws broke my family," she said, her voice devoid of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact. "They named us outcasts because we knew the earth had a spirit, and that it could be wounded. This sickness, this is a wound in your pack's spirit, Kalen." She used his name. It landed between them with the weight of a dropped stone, an act of shocking intimacy. No one but his long-dead mother had ever used his name without a title attached. He felt it strip away another layer of his armor, leaving him exposed. He looked at the sleeping children, their breathing now deeper, more even. Her forbidden magic, her deep knowledge, was saving them. It was saving him. "My father was wrong," he said. The admission cost him everything. It was a betrayal of his lineage, of the very foundation of his power. But as he said it to her, in the quiet of her home, it felt like the first true thing he had said in his entire life. He had come to her for a cure, but what he was finding was a truth he had not known he was seeking. The world outside, Vorlag, the laws of the pack. It was all fading, becoming distant noise. The only thing that felt real was the warmth of the cup in his hands and the steady gaze of the woman who had given it to him. By the fifth day, the fevers had broken. The pups were weak but alert, their eyes clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Lyra was even strong enough to sit up and drink broth from a small wooden bowl Alara held for her. A fragile peace settled over the shelter, the air no longer thick with fear, but with the quiet hum of recovery. Kalen found himself moving with the rhythms of the small house, fetching water from the creek, adding wood to the fire, his large frame adapting to the confined space. He learned the specific scent of the herbs she burned at dusk. He learned the way she held her shoulders when she was tired. He learned the shape of her silence. He was witnessing her, not as the king observing a subject, but as a man seeing a woman in her entirety. And it was, as he had once feared, far worse than being saved. It was an undoing. He was sitting on a low stool, watching Alara change the dressing on another pup's arm where a fever rash had broken out, when she spoke without looking at him. "You know what they will say when you return. They will say, 'I used forbidden magic to save my children,'" he answered, his voice flat. "They will say, 'I consorted with an outcast. Forlog will demand a price.'" "He will demand me," she said. It was a certainty, cold and sharp. She finished tying the bandage and looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. "The law is absolute. The practice of spirit healing is treason. The punishment is death." He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He had known it, of course, but hearing her say it, hearing the calm acceptance in her voice made it unbearable. He had brought this doom to her door. In his desperation to save his children, he had condemned the woman who had saved them. "I am the law," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I will not let that happen." "You are the king," she corrected him gently. "You are a vessel for the law. Vorlog knows that. He will not challenge you with swords. He will challenge you with the words your own father wrote. He will turn your pack against you, not with anger, but with their own fear. He will make me a symbol of everything they have been taught to reject." She was right. He knew she was right. Forlog's power was insidious. He didn't need force. He used the weight of tradition, the inertia of belief. He would paint Alara as a corrupting influence, a witch who had ensnared their king and endangered the purity of the pack. And Kalen, by seeking her help, had handed him the brush. "My family weren't just healers," she said, her voice dropping lower as if sharing a secret she had held for a lifetime. "We were alphas, a different kind of alpha. We believed power came not from dominance, but from balance, from understanding the connection between the pack and the land. Your father called it a weakness. He broke our line, scattered us, and named the survivors Omega, a brand of submission. I am the last." He stared at her, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. She was not just an outcast. She was a living refutation of his entire world order. Her very existence was a threat to the legitimacy of his throne. Their connection was not just forbidden, it was treason. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you need to know who you are choosing to stand with," she said, "and what you will be choosing to abandon." She rose and went to the hearth, her back to him. The choice was his, and she would not influence it. She was offering him an escape. He could return to the Citadel, claim he had been desperate, that she had tricked him. He could sacrifice her to appease Vorlag and preserve the stability he had inherited. It was the sensible path, the king's path. He looked at his children, sleeping peacefully in the warm, safe space she had created. He thought of the bitter tea she had shared with him, a communion in the dead of night. He thought of the quiet strength that had held this world together while his had been falling apart. He had spent his life in a cold, silent palace, surrounded by people who wanted something from him. He had been alone. Here, in this small, crowded room for the first time, he was not. He had been witnessed. The choice had already been made. He had crossed a line he never even saw, and he had no desire to go back. The sound of a horn, sharp and clear, cut through the morning air from the direction of the citadel. A summons, a warning. Vorlag was coming. They came not with weapons, but with the full weight of ceremony. Lord Vorlag led the procession, flanked by the other elders of the council. Behind them, a crowd of pack members followed, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and grim curiosity. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, a silent, judging army. Vorlag alone stepped forward, his silver robe seeming to soak up the morning light. His expression was one of deep, sorrowful regret, a carefully constructed mask of a man forced to do his solemn duty. Kalen met him at the door of the shelter. He stood a full head taller than the elder, a bulwark of quiet power, but Vorlag did not flinch. Kalen, Vorlag said, his voice carrying across the clearing, pitched for the audience behind him. He used the king's formal title, a subtle reinforcement of the roles they were all meant to play. We rejoice that the children are well, but the pack is concerned. They hear whispers of old magic, of forbidden rites performed on the heirs to the throne. The heirs to the throne are alive because of those rites, Kalen said, his voice low and cold. They are alive because of her. He gestured back toward the open door of the cottage, where Alara now stood, framed in the doorway. She was not afraid. She was as still and centered as the ancient oaks around them. Vorlag's gaze slid past Kalen to her, and his expression hardened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of true venom beneath the pious mask. The law is clear, Vorlag said, turning his attention back to Kalen, his voice rising again for the crowd. Our pack was founded on the rejection of such wildness. It is the source of chaos, of imbalance. The woman practiced a treasonous art. For the safety of the pack, for the sanctity of your rule, she must be cleansed. The word hung in the air, a sterile, vicious euphemism. He was giving Kalen the choice she had predicted: condemn her and be the strong king his father was, the king who upheld the law, or defend her and become an apostate. Kalen looked past Vorlag at the faces of his pack. He saw their fear, a fear that had been carefully cultivated for generations. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of anything that did not conform to the rigid order they had been taught was their only salvation. He could give them a speech. He could argue points of law, could try to make them understand. But words were Vorlag's weapon. Arguing on his terms would be a loss before it began. He needed a different language. He turned his back on Vorlag, a profound and deliberate insult, and walked back to the doorway where Alara stood. She was holding a simple ceramic cup filled with the dark, earthy tea she had been giving the children. Steam rose from it in the cool morning air. She had not made it for him. It was for one of the pups. But her eyes met his, and in them, he saw the question. He saw the entire landscape of their shared future or their shared destruction. He reached out and took the cup from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, a small point of contact that felt more significant than any coronation. He turned back to face the crowd, the cup held in both hands. He lifted it to his lips and drank, a long, slow swallow. He did not take his eyes off Vorlag. Silence. The clearing was utterly silent. The birds had stopped singing. The wind held its breath. The act was so simple, so domestic, it was incomprehensible. And yet, everyone understood exactly what it meant. It was not a speech, it was a vow, an alignment, a communion. He was drinking her magic, taking it into himself. He was declaring her a part of his world, her knowledge a part of his strength. He lowered the empty cup. He did not need to speak. His choice was made, not in words, but in a shared cup of tea on the edge of the world. Vorlog's face, for the first time, was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The sorrowful elder was gone, replaced by a man who had just been utterly outmaneuvered. He had come expecting a debate and had been met with an act of quiet, unshakable intimacy. He had lost. Kalen set the cup down carefully on the threshold. He did not look at his pack. He looked only at Alara. The world had shifted on its axis, and the aftershocks were yet to come. The laws would have to be rewritten. Power would have to be redefined. A new history would have to be forged. But in the unnerving stillness of the morning, none of that mattered. He had come to her shelter to take his children home. He had found his own instead.